Christmas Eve, in the city of London, a greedy old man named Mr. Scrooge was counting his money when the door opened and a blast of cold air blew down his coins. "Merry Christmas," said his nephew Fred. "I'd like to invite you to our house for a Christmas party." "Bah, humbug," replied Mr. Scrooge as he banged his fist on the counting table. "If there's anything I hate more than people who owe me money, it's Christmas." Mr. Scrooge ordered his worker, Mr. Cratchit, to put more coal in the fire, as Fred left sadly. "He's only a boy," said Mr. Cratchit. "Perhaps you shouldn't be so rough with him." "Bah, humbug," Mr. Scrooge yelled. "Just for that, no raise this year, and no leaving early." A tear slipped out from Mr. Cratchit's eye. "I'm going home," Mr. Scrooge grumbled. "I don't care if it's Christmas Eve. You're going to have to stay until all the money is counted." The door slammed behind Mr. Scrooge as he entered the busy street. Outside, the people of London were rushing everywhere with packages. A few charity workers held out jars, asking Mr. Scrooge to donate to the orphanage. "Bah, humbug," Mr. Scrooge replied. "Nobody deserves money for nothing." When Mr. Scrooge finally reached home, he sat down and enjoyed his empty house where no one was singing annoying carols. Mr. Scrooge changed into his pajamas and drew the covers up to his chin. As he blew out his candle, Mr. Scrooge heard a clunking noise in the hallway. "Who's there?" he called. No one answered. Suddenly, the figure of his old worker, Mr. Marley, appeared. Mr. Scrooge rubbed his eyes because he knew that Mr. Marley had died years ago. There was a ghost in his house. "I was greedy like you," Mr. Marley said as he rattled the metal chains. "And if you don't change your ways, you'll end up like me." Mr. Scrooge laughed. "I must be dreaming." He closed his eyes and fell back asleep. When the clock chimed 1, another ghost appeared and woke up Mr. Scrooge. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," said a strange-looking figure. This time, the ghost carried him out the window and toward a familiar house. Inside the house, Mr. Scrooge saw himself happily opening Christmas presents as a boy. It was a memory he had forgotten, and for a moment made him happy again. Suddenly, Scrooge realized he was smiling and quickly let out a "Bah, humbug." A moment later, Scrooge found himself back inside his cold bed. "Must have been another dream," he thought. He pulled the covers over his head and tried to fall back asleep. Mr. Scrooge was awakened next by another strange-looking figure. "I am the ghost of Christmas now," said the creature. Quickly, Scrooge was being pulled toward the streets of London. Outside, he heard two charity workers talking. "We haven't raised enough money. The orphanage is going to close." Scrooge frowned, remembering how he'd treated the same charity workers earlier that day. Next, the ghost of Christmas Now led him to the Cratchits' home, where a thin boy wobbled on crutches. "I'm finally home," said Mr. Cratchit as his children ran to hug him. "But I'm sorry. There will be no raise this year. I don't know how we can afford medicine for Tim." "Take me back home," Mr. Scrooge insisted. "I can't watch any more of this." Immediately, Mr. Scrooge returned to his dark bedroom, all alone. Mr. Scrooge found it hard to fall back asleep after what he saw. He got up to get a glass of water when a third ghost appeared.
"I am the ghost of Christmas future,"
said the figure. Mr. Scrooge yawned as the third ghost flew him toward the cemetery. There, he saw the future grave of Mr. Cratchit's son Tim, where his loving family sang and placed flowers on the grave.
"Tim died because his father, your worker, wasn't paid enough to buy medicine,"
said the ghost of Christmas future. In the corner of the cemetery, Mr. Scrooge also noticed a lonely grave that was not well cared for. He moved closer and saw it was his own grave.
"Not one person has come to visit your tombstone,"
said the ghost.
"In fact, I can't think of anyone who even remembers you now."
A chill went through Mr. Scrooge's body. Was it possible that no one would miss him when he died? "I must change my ways, or this is my future," realized Mr. Scrooge. The next morning, Mr. Scrooge sprang out of bed and got dressed in his best Christmas clothes. On his way to his nephew's Christmas party, he dropped a large bag of coins onto the orphanage steps. He also ordered a plump turkey to be sent to the Cratchit family. Instead of yelling his usual "Bah, humbug!" throughout the streets of London, Mr. Scrooge greeted every passer-by with a cheerful "Merry Christmas!" He was welcomed by his nephew Fred and all of his relatives at the party. From that Christmas forward, Mr. Scrooge changed the future of everything. The orphanage stayed open, Mr. Cratchit got his raise, and Tiny Tim got the medicine he needed. As for Mr. Scrooge, there's hardly a child or adult today who doesn't remember his story.